Hello everyone, this is our tutorial 4 and we will be going over rendering using both Rhino and V-Ray. This is our online tutorial and so I'm excited to get started. Please be patient with me as this is my first online tutorial, but I hope it's just as useful as our in-class time. So to begin with, I just wanted to maybe remind you if you haven't used this before, but you do need to use the Sura to access V-Ray, and that's the remote access to Syracuse University's drives. So I've included a link here that'll bring you to the webpage of the ITS where you can download the Sura app on your own computer. So they have a Windows version and also a Mac version. So this brings you to the download page. So then you would just download. I currently already have Sura downloaded, so I'm going to connect. So my VPN is through my settings, and I'll connect. And your login is the same as your My Slice. Okay, and once it connects, I'll walk you through where we can find the V-Ray files. So I'll have to connect the drives. And if I just open a new file explorer, you can see that these two are the Sura drives. So this one is the documents that you've stored on like a lab computer in Silicon. But we're going to use the drive, the G drive, and in the ARC folder, there's a bunch of student resources. So I would strongly suggest you go through these someday because they are very helpful. But we need to go in the softwares folder, V-Ray for Rhino. The 4.1 is the newest version. And this right here is the extension or application file. So you'll need to actually bring this onto your own personal laptop. I've already done this, but this PDF is there to help you. So it's really useful, and actually you really need to pay attention when you follow it because we don't have V-Ray Swarm or Chaos Cloud, but you do need to connect the license through a server, copying this link in. So use this, please, when you download V-Ray on your laptop if you haven't already. And if you have issues, try to troubleshoot within this PDF, like for example down here. But if you have more issues, just let me know and I can try and help as much as I can. So for this tutorial, I've uploaded a Rhino model for you to follow if you would like. It's just a base model. So let's go ahead and open that and get started. All right, so this is what the base model looks like. Nothing's too special here, but we're just going to use this to start setting up a exterior render first. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that our render is set for V-Ray. So if you go to Render, Current Render, make sure it says V-Ray for Render is clicked. All right, now the next thing we need to do is position our camera. There's a couple of things that we can do in this process. Make sure that the camera is open on your properties bar on your right, so we can actually see where the camera is located, the lens length, and what that target is. And another way you can see your camera is actually just by turning your camera on. Type camera in the command and click show. And it'll actually show you what your camera is in the other viewports. This is one way where you can just start to move your camera in position. I'm actually going to turn my camera back off, so hide. So when we're setting up a render, we need to make sure that we are first in 2-point perspective, so that it makes sense as an image rather than a parallel, which would be like an orthographic drawing. And perspective is more for modeling purposes. So 2-point perspective is typically how we see images or see space. So that's usually the route we use for rendering. And then these will help you understand where the camera is and what that lens length should be. I typically use 20. That's just like a wider view. I think it's typically left on 50, which is pretty close up, you can see. So again, I'm going to make mine 20 and then just try to work it into position somewhere around here, like on the path looking at my building. And really pay attention to what the Z location is. So a typical Z would be the height, for example, of a person. So if we change it to 6, that's an actual person. However, I know this road is on a bit of a slant, so I'm just going to bring it up just a tad. Okay, so whenever you're happy with your view, you need to then save that view using the named views command. There's a couple ways to get there. You can type named view, and mine is over here, or you can do the drop down set view named view. Okay, so I'm going to save this as exterior 1. All right, and that's our named view. And it's really important to get a named view because when we're rendering, we want to make sure it's in the specific spot that we've set up. And especially if you need to export like line work and you want to make sure that everything lines up. Okay, so let's get started in V-Ray. So launch your V-Ray asset window. And if for some reason that toolbar is not popping up, just right click anywhere in your toolbar and click show toolbar and just go all the way down to V-Ray. I just have the compact, or you can open the all, or if you need lights, you can just grab those here. Okay, so we need to get this set up for the exterior lighting first. So there's a couple settings that I want to walk through. I typically leave it on the GPU because my CPU, it'll run a bit slower. That's just the graphics card of my computer, so you can just pick whichever one works best for you or look up what's best for your type of computer. We want to make sure this interactive is turned on because we're going to be doing a lot of testing. Interactivity, I'm leaving mine as high. If this is slowing your machine down, you can always decrease this. In our render output, the save frame option will just show you what is going to be cropped out when you render. Currently this is cropping out kind of a lot, but maybe that's okay for today's purposes, but use this to help you guide where you need to set your window. Like if you need to zoom back to really capture what you're after, I would use that as a guide. And actually I like this better, so I'm going to do an exterior 2 and save that. Okay. These are the image width and height. Typically, if you know the size of your paper or what you want to print it as or display it as, it's good to know ahead of time so you know that your image is a high-res render image. I'm going to bump this up to like maybe 700. 700 is good for me today, or maybe 1,000. And I like to leave it at this like widescreens, but you can again change this if you want to. And we're going to check material overrides on because right now we're going to set up the sun and sky settings. So we don't actually need materials currently. So when that is all complete, click the render with interactive window and it'll pop up with the current render of our environment. All right, everything looks okay. The next thing we need to do is set our background texture. I'm going to use just a typical sky texture. But first we need to clear the current background texture. So if you right-click this texture slot underneath the Environments tab, click Clear, and you'll see it'll repopulate our interactive window. It may take a minute. You can see it's rendering when this red box comes up, because I could stop the render, but I'm just going to leave it for now. It probably just takes a while. So the next thing I need to do is add the sky texture. So if I left click this, I can add sky texture. Okay, so that looks very oversaturated. If I open this triangle, it opens up the properties for the sky texture. So I can actually change the color of the sky if I wanted to do like maybe a really light blue. Another thing you want to look at changing is the intensity multiplier, because as we can see, it's really strong. So maybe if I do like 0.25, yeah, so that's starting to get a little bit better. The next thing we need to do is, maybe if I bring this down just a bit more. Yeah, we can always come back and edit that if we want. So the next thing we need to do is add the sun. And actually, I'm going to go back and turn off my safe frame because we don't need that on anymore. Okay, so turning on the sun is using the Rhino sun. So you can type sun in the command bar, or mine is over here in the settings, and just click on. And mine actually didn't look too bad when it turned on, but sometimes it looks super oversaturated. But again, we can fix that down here in our sun settings. You can change, if you know your site location, you can actually search where your site is. Like for example, if we said this is in Boston, that's great. It'll change the properties of the sun to have the same properties of that location. Okay. The next thing we can do with the sun is we can change the month and the year here, and we can also change the hour of the day here. So for example, if you wanted to do like early morning render or an evening render. Today we're just going to do maybe a midday. Okay, actually I think that looks better. Okay, one of the great things we can do with this interactive window is use this render region command, because if you know you're going to render something and it might take a long time and you just want to test, if you click on this, you can actually draw a region and it'll just render what's inside this region. So for example, if we wanted to go back through and edit the shadows, what we can do is go back to your this tab, the textures tab, and have the environment sky checked, and we could go back and edit down here with the size multiplier. We increase that to, for example, like 10. You can see that the shadow becomes less defined. So for this purposes, I think that is a great quality. So I'm going to say, yep, that looks great, and go back. And if I want to stop rendering just the region, I just click on this again, and it'll re-render the entire image with that property that I just changed. Right, the next thing we're going to do is start to apply some materials. That's maybe one of the greater things about using V-Ray is the amount of materials and their accuracy. So the first thing we need to do is make sure our material override is checked off, because now we want to start rendering with actual materials. And one thing you see that it did is, again, it's really oversaturated. So we need to go back through and change our exposure value. Currently it's set at 10, which is fine. The higher this number, it's actually going to be, it'll darken this image because it's letting less light into the camera. So maybe if we do maybe 13, maybe I'll come back through and just, sorry, I just want this to be bright enough so that we can see some of these updates. So lighting is just a bit of a game, I guess you could say, that you have to play, just testing what's the best lighting for your render. Okay, maybe this is good, and maybe this can be 12.5. Let's see. Okay, maybe that's good. Okay, so again, make sure that your material override is checked off, and we're going to expand this other side to see, sorry, I'm going to clear that, to see our materials library. You can, currently I've left it at this view. If you like it more of like a stacked, you can change that down here, either columns or this like stacked view. I'm going to leave it like this today. And you should see this materials library that V-Ray already has access to. And there's a great number of materials within this library that we're going to use today. And then we'll walk through how you actually make your own material. There's a couple ways to apply materials. Personally, I like to add it through selection. You could do it through layers, like over here. But today we're just going to add by selection, and I'll show you what that means in just a minute. So the first material we're going to add is the glass. So I'm just going to search glass, and you can see it populates all these different types of glass in our materials library. Maybe I like this one's pretty nice. So I'm going to come over here and find my Windows layer, and I'm right clicking that and select objects, and you can see in my Rhino those objects are selected, and I'm going to right click this glass that I like and do add to selection. So you can see it's changed in our render. It's added that material, and we can see that material in our materials tab. And if you need to edit those materials, you can expand this and edit the properties here. Like, for example, if we wanted the reflection to be a bit less, we can change that here. We could also change the diffuse color. Currently it's set to black. If we wanted like a slight blue, maybe. Again, that might be a bit hard to see. Okay. And we could change the opacity of that material, although let's leave it at 1. Okay. So now we have our glass. And the next element we're going to do is grass. So in our layers tab, I'm going to right click, select objects for the grass, and in our materials library, I'm going to search grass. For grass, I'm going to use this grass D. So again, right click, add to selection. Okay, so a few things about the grass. it currently has no texture map, which means it's kind of just like thrown onto this surface, and the proportion is completely off. So we're going to do some texture mapping. First thing I want to do is actually fix my glass. All right, that looks better. Okay, so one thing I would suggest doing when you get going and moving through, for example, I just cycled through and added a lot of materials that we're not currently using. There's this broom button down at the bottom, and you can purge unused assets. Not just get rid of all of those elements to keep it organized and so we can see what we're actually using. Okay, so this grass, keep in mind this 200 centimeters, that's actually a measurement that gives us a sense of scale that this texture is at. And if you convert 200 centimeters, it's actually 78 inches. So this is going to be important when we texture map. So I'm going to go to the top view just so we can see what's happening and turn on the render. You can see that this texture is just extremely large. So if I select the objects for the grass layer, I'm going to the Properties tab. There's the texture mapping, and this is super important. You always need to texture map for textures like grass or specific textures like wood or brick. And most of the time, almost like 99% of the time, you're going to use this box mapping. So I'm going to click box mapping. It's going to ask me the first corner. It actually doesn't matter where you put it. So I'm just going to click into space, and I'm going to use the parameters of that 200 centimeters, so 78 inches by 78 inches by 78 inches. Click enter, capped, yes, and click enter. Okay, so we can see that it remade that texture based on that texture mapping, and the scale of this, the grass, is now correct. If we ever need to go back and edit that texture mapping, you can click show mapping over here, and it'll show us that box. And that box is three-dimensional. So if I go into the perspective view, it'll show me that box, and I can start to rotate. I can scale if there was a scale issue, but again, we know that it's meant to be that 200 centimeters. So I'm going to leave it just like that. And you need to hide that mapping once you're done editing it, otherwise that'll just stay there. So I'm going to hit hide mapping. Okay, and you can see that our interactive window updated to what I set because we were editing that. So I'm just going to reset our view to exterior 2. Okay, so far looking good. Another great aspect of using V-Ray is this geometry tab. And one geometry that's really good for grass, or to actually make it look textured, is this fur texture. So to actually add this three-dimensional property onto our grass without us actually having to model that as grass. So here, I'll show you what I mean. So if I right-click, select objects, I can apply to selection. And you can see in our interactive window, it populated these grass-like textures. Obviously, the scale is way out of proportion here, but again, it's much easier to do this in V-Ray rather than digitally making all of these textures. So we need to edit the texture size because again, it's completely out of proportion here. So I was messing around with it previously, and so I know this is about 18. This is the count per area. So you can see there's a lot more populated within this, but once I reduce the length of this, that's going to change. So about a half in an inch maybe, and 0.015 in thickness, and the taper maybe 0.09. Let's see what that looks like. And again, if this is slowing down your interactive window, this might be a good time to use that render region and just test out just one region within this larger render. So yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. The last thing we need to do is set the material to our actual grass. So if we activate this material, we can hit to grass. Just take a minute to update that. All right. So it may be a little tough to see right now, but you can see our edges are less defined. It acts as the properties that grass might actually take on. So yeah, I would explore with some of these other geometry aspects, but again, fur is a really good one for grass. Another method for materials is actually creating our own material. So if, for example, we wanted like a really nice wood texture and we just weren't happy with the wood that was in here, there's a simple route that we can make our own texture. So I'm just going to go and do a Google search and look for wood seamless texture. So there's a lot of great textures that you can use. Just be careful again that it's a seamless texture, and what that means is when it replicates or duplicates onto a surface, there's no seams. You can't tell that it's been duplicated. So this would be a good one, but you have to cut off this watermark. The one I've downloaded is this one, so I'm going to save this image. And we are going to open up Photoshop. If you wanted to edit this texture just using Photoshop, go ahead and do so. Like if you wanted it to be a darker wood with maybe a bit more contrast, you can use the just general settings that we've gone over in the class before. Okay, so if I like this texture, just go ahead and make sure to merge this down to flatten and save this as a JPEG. Wood texture. Okay, all looks well. And the next thing we need to do is make a bump map for V-Ray to actually understand this texture and give it a more three-dimensional quality. So there's two things that V-Ray is looking for. It's looking for a grayscale, which is like a black and white image, and a high contrast image. So we can edit our image just using the hue and saturation, bringing our saturation completely down to black and white. And I might actually bring up our lightness just a hair. And the next thing we need to do is increase the contrast. So using the brightness contrast, image adjustments, brightness contrast. So bring up that brightness, and again, we want that high contrast. Really, the bump map should be like the high and low of this image. So for example, the cracks need to really be showing, and also these knots. but the smaller level detail aren't as important. So if you do a squint test, that usually helps to determine what's important for the bump map. Let's say about there looks pretty good. So again, just file save this as a JPEG. And we're going to name it wood texture bump. And I'm just going to do 2 because I've already done a bump. Okay, so now back in V-Ray, under our materials tab, we can add a material down here. So we're going to just add material, and we're just going to use a generic material. I'm going to close this side and open this side to edit this new material that we just made. I'm going to double click it to rename it like exterior or just wood texture. Okay, so in our editing panel for this material, we can add our image of the wood. So the image is going to come in as a bitmap. And open up our wood texture. All right, so this is what it looks like. If for some reason you don't see this image, because the first time I did this, I didn't, you can hit this render button and it'll render the image. And go ahead and hit the back button. And you can see it updated it on this material icon. Again, if you don't see that, you can hit this render button. The next thing we need to do is add our bump map. So go down to bump, add or activate, and we're going to add it right here, and it's a bitmap as well. And wood texture bump map 2, open. Okay, that looks great, and go back. Okay, so this is our texture that we just created. You can again edit some of the properties within here, like for example, the reflection glossy. I'm going to turn this down because the wood texture I want isn't necessarily that glossy. You can play with refraction and opacity. This is not opaque or completely opaque. Okay, so once you're happy with your texture, let's add it to the walls. So select objects, apply to selection, and it's going to update right there. Okay, so the major thing that's wrong with this texture right now is it's not texture mapped again. So we need to go back through in our Rhino under the property or under, oops, sorry, I need to select objects. Under the properties, go to texture mapping, and again, we need the box mapping. This one, it might be helpful if you turn on your rendered viewport, and I'm just going to try and zoom in. And since I don't know the size of this, I'm going to just kind of guess. Let's do maybe 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. And let's see what that gives us. Okay, so that texture is looking to be about what I want it. However, I'm going to show my mapping. I do want to rotate this texture. There's a couple ways I can do that. I can rotate this box. You can see it does get messed up here a bit. Or I can use the command over here and rotate. So let's see if we rotate this 90, what happens? Okay, so that looks That looks okay. Maybe it looks better. If we rotate like 45, what does that look like? No. Let's just leave it as 90. You can see that my box map actually moved way out here when I rotated. I'm just going to bring it back in. And maybe I'm just going to increase this a little bit. I'm just holding Shift. And you can change how much the texture repeats itself, because you can see here there's kind of these seams. So I wonder if we do like 2, that gets a way smaller. We do 0.5, it's way larger. Again, holding Shift. All right. So again, you have to texture map. It's super important when you're rendering to get the material quality that you're after, and how that material responds to your model. So I'm going to hide this mapping. I'm going to set our view back to exterior 2. And let's see what our interactive render looks like. It's looking good. Another material that I think is great from the materials library is actually water. Water is under the liquid tab, and you can see there's a couple of these waves. So I'm actually going to apply that to our water layer. So if I select objects, let's use this first one, add to selection, and you can see it updated here. And in this view, the water might look okay, but again, if you look at a different view, let's maybe say like the top, you can see how patchy this material has texture mapped onto the surface. So again, we need to texture map this material by going to the Properties tab, Texture Mapping, Box Mapping. And again, this is at 200 centimeters, so we know that that's 78 inches by 78 inches. So I'm just going to do that. So 78 inches, 78 inches, 78. Okay. I think this is best shown in maybe the perspective view. And you can start to see it in the interactive window best here, how that texture of the waves actually begins to map onto this surface. Okay. Setting our view back to exterior 2. The last texture, I'm going to apply just a matte black to the mullions and to the roof and to the floor. So if I go back to my layers, I can select mullions. I'm holding down Control. I'll select the roof with objects. And I'm just going to create a material, just a generic material. And I'm just going to call it matte black. And all I'm going to do is change this diffuse color just to like a black. And I don't want it that glossy, so I'm going to turn that down. And I'm going to right click and apply to selection. Okay, it looks like it's not updating in this window. Okay. And maybe I want the floor to be like a concrete. So it's under concrete. So maybe like this concrete. Apply to selection. And again, when we zoom in here, we're going to see that we have to texture map, looking at this from an interior view. So we're going to use the box texture mapping, properties, box, and this said it was 2 meters. So 2 meters is about 78 inches, so 78. Okay. And that's what our new texture looks like. I'm actually going to just rotate texture a little bit because you can see the seams. Okay. Maybe the columns can be that same same concrete. Okay. And one of the last things I want to do is the asphalt. If I select, so that's the roadways and the sidewalk. Okay, that's underground. Let's do maybe this one. To selection. And again, we have to texture map. Apply box mapping. I'm just doing 78 again, 78 inches. Okay, and that's our texture. If for some reason you need to delete a texture map, you can always go to this delete mapping, and it'll essentially just reset it back with no mapping. And then we have to just reapply or make a new box map. Okay. Okay, so that's our current render. Starting to get better. Again, I think we're having a bit of a light issue. Maybe if we change these or go back to our the camera, the exposure value, and increase that just a bit. Yeah, that's getting better. Okay. There's another way that we can apply an environment to the background, and that's through what's called a dome light. And dome lights use what's an HDRI image. And I've included this in the tutorial, this HDRI image, and I found a website that has a lot of free backgrounds that you can download. And this can help create like a immersive environment without even photoshopping a background. So I've used this one previously, but maybe let's use this one. And I'll show you how to actually map this onto the background in Rhino. I think I just did the 4K last time. You can do a higher quality one if you would like. That just might take too long for today's purposes. So once you find an HDRI image, we can go back to our Rhino, and what we need is the dome light. And so we don't have that property up here. So if I show toolbar, go all the way down to V-Ray lights, turn that one on, and it'll give us all the different V-Ray lights. Oops. And this is the icon that we need for the dome light. So click that, and it's going to ask you, well, where do you want the location? And sorry, I'm going to change our viewport to just like a shaded. Click, and I'm doing the Cape Hill. And you'll see it automatically updates our interactive window. So this arrow is that light source, is directly linked to the light source of the image. So we can actually position it to align with what time of day we have simulated this render for. So you can see our light is somewhere down here, southwest. But in this case, I think we can get it sort of close, and then we need to rotate this down a little bit to get rid of the line there. Oops. I'm just undoing, roughly get it there. Okay. So one thing that we need to do is actually edit the properties of this light source, because you can see it kind of darkened our render. And we can do that by changing the intensity of that image. So let's increase that to like 15 and see what. All right, so we're back to our bright environment. And you can edit and alter the reflections of this texture, and also the diffuse light. I think it looks fine. I actually might decrease this just a hair, just a little bit. Maybe it's still a bit bright. Okay. Right, so that is the dome light. It actually starts to respond with some of these materials, like for example, the light on the water. If I rotate it just a bit more, you can start to see that light coming into the water, which I think that's the effect I would like for this render. Okay, so something like that. The light actually starting to hit the water and getting those reflections. Okay, so one of the last things we're going to go over is entourage in our V-Ray. It's really important to think about the workflow or strategies that keep in mind your strengths and abilities when modeling and outputting this render. If, for example, you don't have time to Photoshop everything, maybe it's a good idea to find entourage with some of the sites that we've included. Another thing to think about is shadows, like dynamic environments such as like trees have really unique shadows that might be easier to do in V-Ray, for example, rather than in Photoshop. But again, if you feel more comfortable doing entourage in Photoshop, then go ahead and keep doing that all you would like. This is just a good exercise to broaden your knowledge with other entourage methods. Another thing to keep in mind is entourage gives your environment a sense of life. So think about like the mood you would like to convey. What are the activities that take place during this environment, and how can you use entourage to support those activities? So we've included a couple really useful websites. The one I'm using today is Flying Architecture. If you're not familiar with these sites, definitely take a look at them. They're great to find and download models. So Flying Architecture, if we go to 3D models, I'm just going to click on one and it'll bring us to their main webpage. And they have a bunch of different models of furniture, lighting, people, architectural elements. The one downfall about this site is that these do cost money, but please don't feel that you need to buy them. There's always free versions somewhere. So if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can see that these two are completely free, so you can download them, which I already have. And there's other good models, such as natural elements. These are going to be like trees. There's grass textures, but again, don't feel that you need to buy them because there's other sources to look first. So I've downloaded a couple of these elements and I'm just going to bring them into our model. And I'm just going to hide that so I don't accidentally, oops. Okay. So the way that I found it's easiest to bring in entourage is just importing them into my Rhino file. So if I just do import, and I go to my entourage, I'm going to bring in the casual person and click open. Keep in mind these files are usually large. They're usually like a heavy mesh file, so it might take your computer time to open this file. It's also a good time to save your model before you bring these elements into it, because it's going to make our file size a lot larger. So I have imported all of the entourage that I'll be using today. Again, this is going to make your file size a lot larger. And actually I had an issue where my file crashed, so that's why I had to stop and import them without the recording. So it was just a bit too much for my computer to handle. But okay, so here is a tree. So I'm going to just place it into my site, positioning it into the render, but again, we don't want this to overpower our render. We can start to see it maybe a bit better in this view. And just moving it into a place that I like. I imagine that the site might have more of these elements, so I'm just going to copy and paste the tree to duplicate it. Just move this second tree into place. Maybe this second tree is the smaller one. Just using the gumball to change the size. Update our view to the exterior render, see if we can see our new tree. That we can. And actually, I'm going to move this one a bit closer to us. A bit. Like that. Okay, those are looking good. The next thing I'm going to position is I have the person that's sitting down. I'm going to just move her into view. I'm going to open up this viewport, and actually I'm going to just set the settings just back to perspective so I can see it better. I might just minimize this for now. Okay. So this is our human. Position them be within the space, and this person is actually in a sitting position, which is perfect because I have this fake bench I've made. Just trying to position them close as I can. Because unfortunately, most of these are meshes, and you can't just use the typical move command with a mesh. I'm just going to have to use Gumball to eyeball it. Looks like we're still cutting through our bench. If we rotate and then move down. We're still lifting up a bit. So if we rotate back. Alright, that's looking good for now. A little bit through. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so we have our person in our space. You can see. Maybe better further down on the bench. And the second person is going to be walking on our path. So I'm just going to bring them in to view. We don't want a shadow on this person, so I'm going to just make sure that they are just on the road. All right, so let's see what our view looks like. Okay, looking good. Maybe they're a bit closer to the camera, just to give our view a bit more of a dynamic. And let's see what our interactive window looks like. All right, so we can see that our person currently is hovering, which is not good. So let's just try to get them down. All right, that looks better. Okay, so that is our current render. Let's go ahead and get everything set up for a final render. So let's open our V-Ray assets, and I'm going to stop the interactive window because we don't need it right now. I'm going back to my settings. So there's a couple things we need to make sure before we send out for the final render. In our renders tab in Rhino, I'm actually going to bump this up to 300 and make sure that this is final quality. All right, and jumping back to our V-Ray, we can turn off interactive because we don't need that window anymore. We want our quality to the very high, the maximum quality for our final render. And again, under this render output, the larger this image size is, the more high res your render will be. So let's just bump it up to maybe 3000. And there's a couple of properties that we want to make sure our final render tab has. So under this layers tab, we can click any of these and it'll output these render types. So one that might be useful to you is the material ID or material ID color. So go ahead and click that one on. And another one that might be useful is the shadows. And click that on. You can explore with these and see which ones you might use in the future. Atmosphere, raw shadows, maybe. And when you expand this, it'll actually explain what that render output will be. So for example, this raw shadow, it stores the information about the cast shadows for the lighting in the scene. So it's like a reverse image. So you could use this in Photoshop, for example, if you're doing a certain type of render. This material ID, I know some of you have used this in last semester's tutorial, and that just gives us the flat color, so we can use that in Photoshop. So now that we have all the render types that we want, we can go ahead and hit this render, which is typically going to take a long time. So this is always a good idea to save your file before you render. Just because if your model crashes during the render, you don't want to lose everything that we've already made. And I think it should be good to render, so I'm just going to go ahead and click render, which is going to take some time. The render has finally finished, so you can see this is our final render image, and the quality of that, you can zoom in with the wheel on your mouse and see just how the accuracy level in this Rhino or in this rendering is, which is great. So before we export, we can actually start to edit this render within V-Ray by opening this corrections control. And so these are editing tools within the image, and they're quite similar to Photoshop or any other image editing program. So for example, we can start to look at the exposure. Maybe we want to increase to try and brighten up. Like for example, this is quite dark in here. Maybe we want a little more contrast. So you can start to play with these to really create the image quality that you want before you even export this to bring into, for example, Photoshop. Curves. Again, it's just like you would edit in Photoshop the curve. Typically you want like a S curve. All right. Maybe hue and saturation. Oh, this might be too intense. Yeah. So give those a try and just start to edit your image within V-Ray. Also, we can look at the other layers that we rendered for our output. For example, we asked for material ID, which is this one. So we can actually bring this into Photoshop and start photoshopping this if we wanted to do like a flat texture image. Let's turn these off. This one is the shadows. You can see a couple of them here. And some light qualities within there. So I'm going to turn these back on. So once you're ready to export this, you do that through this save icon. So you save current channel, and I'm just going to say render 1 and just save that as an image. And you can just go through these and save these as well. Maybe this is material ID. And maybe shadows. Okay, and once you're done, you can just go ahead and close out of this render, but before you close out, make sure you have exported all your images that you want, because once we exit out of this, our render is no longer there and it will take just as long to re-render. Right, the last thing I wanted to show you all is that if you were to bring this file onto a different computer and you wanted to keep all your materials, the way you do that is you go V-Ray package the project, and it'll create a zip folder with all of those materials that we used. So I'll save that. And you can see within the zip folder, these are all the materials that we used for this project. So you would need to bring the zipped file onto a different computer. For example, if you needed to use the lab computer because it's faster at rendering, this would be the way to do that. So that is our V-Ray portion of tutorial 4.